So today I wanted to talk about the topic of low unit counts in Fire Emblem Fangame chapters, and specifically earlier or first chapters, which is a bit of a wordy topic, but I think there's a lot of merit to be had in, discussing this. So we should probably start with the vanilla games that the fan games are based off of, right? So let's start with Fire Emblem 8, a very simple game, a very easy game that's often recommended to new time players. So here the chapter is basically a really narrow corridor where you can send your units into and win super easily. And I have a feeling that it's meant to be played on the lower difficulty, so normal and easy, where you're told how to play the game exactly, taught about the basic mechanics, and it lets the players kind of get acquainted with the gameplay of Fire Emblem if they haven't played it before. So it's effective at doing that, and it gives you Seth, which helps you feel pretty powerful because, Seth is powerful. And that way it motivates you to keep playing. And the next example is Fire Emblem 9's prologue, which I don't have a screenshot here of, but it's just a simple 1 versus 1 with Ike and Grail. And the idea here is that Ike is undergoing some sort of training or test, and the player is sort of getting trained in the basic mechanics of Fire Emblem as well. So the simplicity of the situation helps grasp mechanics like damage numbers, defense, stats, movement, all that sort of thing, without bringing in more units or more skills or more movement types or whatever to, confuse the player more right off the bat if they're new to the series. And then the third example, which is probably the worst one, is Fire Emblem 7, Chapter 11, the first map of Hector mode, where you have Hector and Matthew. So this is obviously because of story reasons, which I'll be getting into later, but the issue here, from a gameplay standpoint, is that you've gone from the end of Lin mode, which is, you have a lot of more units, and you know how the game works, because Lin mode explains it to you in maybe too much detail. But here you're brought back down to 2 units, and you don't have that many options. And there's no excuse, again, because it's not teaching you anything. It's just limiting you arbitrarily. It's limiting you arbitrarily. And I think this is a bad chapter for that reason, even though there are multiple paths. And I want to get into it now, but there's a whole section dedicated to exactly why chapters like this are bad from a more experienced player standpoint. So we should move on. So let's move on to what I guess is, what I would consider good examples of vanilla Fire Emblem game chapter 1s, which are FE11 and Fire Emblem 5 Thracia 776. So the main reason these I think are better is because they have higher unit counts and they don't handhold you, which is a bad thing if you're a new player, but if you're an experienced player, it lets you just start playing immediately, experimenting with these units, figuring out new strategies and all that sort of thing. And I'm going to explain why this is more important in the next slide. I don't have much else to say other than these are pretty solid chapters just on their own without even considering tutorials, whereas the other chapters that I said were good first chapters with low unit counts were good as tutorials and nothing else. These are just solid chapters overall, I'd say. Of course, Fire Emblem 11 has the boss that is a bit of a problem, but the structure overall is still solid. So I wanted to move on to some Fangame examples that you can reference and play and take lessons from. The first one is Vision Quest, and I want to point out that this game doesn't give you any sort of tutorial like the other ones. It just drops you in like Fire Emblem 11 or Fire Emblem 5, and you have to make your own strategy and escape. And there's actually reinforcements that come behind you, which makes it a really stressful chapter if you aren't adept at playing. So I think the reason why this chapter can get away with it and why it's so good, well, first, why it's so good is because you just have so many options. You have 5 units, I think, to play around with. You have a lot of different ways to approach the map. You can steal vulneraries, you can visit houses, you can ignore both these things and just gun it for the escape point. Your units are pretty capable of going whichever way you want them, so you have flexibility in how you split and who you send where. And the reason the game can do this is because anyone playing a Fangame or ROM hack has to be acquainted with Fire Emblem already. They have to have at least played one other game. Otherwise, they're not going to be interested in this sort of thing. So it's okay to forego tutorials in this case, because this is one of the major advantages of ROM hacking and Fangame creation, in my opinion. You can just assume the players, maybe they're not great at Fire Emblem, but they know how it works. So you don't have to waste any time explaining it to them. Just drop them in the action and go. And so something that runs sort of counter to this is 7 siblings. And you might notice that I've brought this up as a positive example in the section in this whole PowerPoint where I'm talking about how 2 units are bad and anything above 3 is good. But that's because the creator of this hack had something really specific in mind. He wanted his family to be able to play it, and his family were not particularly experienced with Fire Emblem. So if you're doing something like that, I think this is okay, but it has to be specific. Like, you can't just say, I want new players to play it, because they're not. No one who hasn't played Fire Emblem cares about Fire Emblem ROM hacks, I'm sorry to say. Maybe if it's the Pokemon Fire Emblem hack, maybe, but if it's more traditional Fire Emblem, no one's going to care. So you have to have a specific audience in mind if you're going to try to introduce them with a simpler chapter. And it should be over quick. So I'm not saying you can't do it, but you should have very specific reasons for why. Then I want to move on to Souls of the Forest, which you could say is extremely different from most vanilla games aside from Fire Emblem 12. And despite this, it has you with 5 units, and I mean, you can learn the ropes pretty easily even if you haven't played Fire Emblem 12. The house there explains some stuff to you. It's a pretty safe environment. There's choke points near the starting point, so you can retreat to them if you want. And the map is overall very, I guess, kind in letting you be able to tackle it at your own pace and learn about the different things like the increased weapon triangle, Canto Plus, how important 2 to 3 range bows are and all that. And despite the fact that the hack is so, difficult overall, this first chapter still helps you get into it while still being engaging on its own merits. So I wanted to discuss, I've brought up a couple times 4 units as the minimum, and you might be wondering, why is it 4? Why is it not 3, or why is it not 2, or why not even 1? So I kind of wanted to explain this more in depth, and this is because 4 units offers 3 things that I think is really important, and 2 of them are kind of the same thing. But first of all, we have flexibility. With 4 units, you can basically, assuming these units are either like 2-hit KOing the enemies or something similar, you can pair them in different ways, as opposed to maybe 2 units where you basically have to do the same thing every time. Every player is going to do the same thing. 4 allows you some creativity. Maybe I don't want to use the pre-promote crutch character if there is one as much, and I want to overuse the growth units. 4 lets you do that. With 2, you'll just have a Lord and a pre-promote crutch character if you do have one. And this just allows the player to have a lot more of an engaging time playing your game. They're trying to create their own strategy instead of adhering to your own. And 4 units provides just enough options that the map can be interesting with them, as opposed to 2 or 3. Then the second one is splits. So obviously you can't split a 2-unit army because it'll just turn into soloing each side of the split. And maybe you think you can split a 3-unit army, right? 2 and 1. But the side with 1 unit will, again, just be a solo fest. It's just when you get to 4 units that you can actually split 2 and 2, and you can choose which units to send where, which is, again, another added bonus in the flexibility department and lets the player have more choice. And then replayability, again, factors into flexibility. On replays, you might want to do something different, which 2 or 3 units might not let you do, but 4 or 5. I think 5 is ideal. 5 units would let you do it pretty easily. And this also applies across a player-based scale, right? So instead of replayability, maybe imagine 5 different players playing the map 5 different ways instead of 2 different ways or 1 different way. And that's going to be a lot more interesting for each person because they're personalizing their experience on their own merits. So I think something that might come up here is, what if my game has mechanics that the player might not be familiar with, or they're more complex, and I want to tutorialize them? So I'm going to go about some ways you can tutorialize these things without making the game not fun. So first thing you need to do is determine whether a tutorial or anything like that is even necessary at all. People who play ROM hacks they're not babies, they're not dumb. So you can assume some sort of base level of it, competency at the game from them, like I've said. So if it's something that you can easily grasp, you hand it to a playtester maybe and they say, yeah, I don't have any problem with this, then you don't need a tutorial. But again, if you do, let's move on to some ways you can do this without reducing the unit count. The most, I guess, heavy-handed way to do it would be system text. It's tutorial text that pops up telling you this is how this mechanic works. I wouldn't recommend this unless it's something that you can explain in maybe 2 sentences or less. But it helps if you don't want to make the first chapter not fun. Just explain the mechanic quickly and dump them into the game. Then the second one is show this mechanic being used in a non-gameplay scenario, so like a cutscene. So I guess if I want my game to center around thieves stealing items, I would have some sort of cutscene introduction where, I don't know, my main character who is a thief steals something, and it's made clear that this is a pretty good thing and he's going to be doing a lot more of it in the future. And this sort of ties into character dialogue, right? Having a character mention a mechanic without having it be too ham-fisted. And then on top of all this, what you can do is have a slow introduction. So in the first chapter, of course you've probably heard this time and time again, introduce a mechanic in a safe environment. So in the first chapter, just have a taste of the mechanic maybe, or have it be in a situation that's low risk and the player can learn about it normally. And then probably my final thing here is try to get creative with it. I don't have all the answers and I don't claim to. There's probably a lot more things you can do past what I've mentioned here, but try to get it so that your chapter can have 4 or more units and still be, fun and have lots of options while still not overwhelming the player. And, if you need to, then sure, have a 2-unit prologue. But I encourage you to try as hard as you can to find any solution to the issue before you even remotely consider lowering the unit count. So, and then another thing I wanted to mention is, this sort of ties into everything I've said before, but initial impressions of the project, which is, this is the first part of gameplay you'll be having. What kind of message do you want it to send? Do you want it to send the message of, this is going to be a hack or game where, I'm trying to restrict the player, or I don't have confidence in the player? You don't want to send that sort of message, even if it's not something the player picks up on explicitly, they might consider it. And even though your first chapter isn't everything in your game, uh, whatever your player experiences first will really stick in their memory as, you know, the whole, the main core around what every other part of their opinion is built around. Like something like Vision Quest, I was praising it for having a good first map. I don't think the hack is perfect. I think there are a lot of forgettable maps. I think there are issues with the game, but the first map is so solid and such a good example of what to do that I still recommend playing it, even if you just experience that, just to find out what you like about it, what you don't like about it. So something like that can leave a lasting impression on the player and have them thinking about it in a positive way from the very start, which is pretty good, if I would say, because, you know, if your game starts off bad, then you have to basically build the trust up with the player that it's good and build a sort of confidence in the game from zero. But if you can get that right away, then it'll be a lot easier for the player to play the rest of the game and eventually finish it. So probably this is the most important part. This ties back into what I was saying about Fire Emblem 7 Hector Mode Chapter 1, which is story gameplay integration, which is obviously a super important concept to all of Fire Emblem, and I wouldn't say it isn't, right? And a lot of people in the community, they have these story ideas which they've been thinking about, ruminating about for years, even before they even touch, you know, Fire Emblem Builder or build files or FEXNA, you know, all these different programs, whatever you want, SRPG Studio. They're thinking of the story before all of that. And so it naturally gets to be something that's very close to their heart. Maybe you have an idea like this. But something I want to mention is that this can cloud your judgment, right? So say I have a story about a loner character, and to emphasize this, I want the first chapter to be just them, one unit, right? In this case, story is something that is basically overtaking the gameplay to the point where gameplay is negatively affected in a major way. So more of a balance is good, right? Because you of course want your story to be interesting and compelling and stick to your vision, but you also want the gameplay to be interesting and compelling and engage the player. So something I think is really important is to weigh these things. Maybe get someone else to play your game. Play testing is always the answer, I've said. But yeah, getting someone else to play, asking them maybe a suggestion they have. Keep in mind that you're always making a game and not a book. If you have a story to tell and you don't want the player to play anything, then you write a book or you create a visual novel, right? But because you've chosen this avenue, there's going to be gameplay. And that gameplay has to be good, because why else are you including it? So this isn't to say story is useless, you should discard it, but remember to keep a balance with this. And I have a few ideas on, you know, how to adapt a more a story that's not as suited to higher unit count gameplay. So probably my immediate suggestion is, if I have less than 4 units, just turn it into a cutscene with a few event battles, some moving map sprites, and some text and dialogue. The player can watch it and they don't need to experience the boring gameplay for themselves. Something else is, if it's a really short chapter and there's not much going on, just skip it entirely and summarize it in the next chapter, if it's possible. This is less of an option that you can just immediately do regardless of the game. But if you can fit it in, then I'd do that, because it shortens the game time significantly before you get to actually playing. And then, again, my third suggestion is, I don't know everything. Find some really creative way. Maybe what you could do is have a flashback in the middle of the game via a guide and chapter where the character is misremembering the story as having more people in it than there actually were, and that way you get 4 units. I'm not sure. It's not a great idea. I just came up with it right now, but yeah, the fact remains that you should be creative in your solutions to these problems. So, in conclusion, I don't have much else to say. Try to keep your chapters 4 units or above, especially first chapters. If this is happening later in the game, you definitely want to have 4 or above, because taking away so many deploy slots from the player feels really limiting. Find ways to make your chapters fun, get them play tested, ask people for input on how you can, help, you can, improve it, all that. I don't really have anything else to say other than, avoid low unit prologues or chapter 1s and have fun making your game,